After 41 years, is the video game industry finally headed towards another crash? Because there's so much stuff with all these companies, EA, Sony, Microsoft last month also had layoffs. All these big companies are doing layoffs. That means that these companies are losing money and that something's going wrong. Not really. The system is working as intended. These are publicly traded corporations whose sole purpose is to maximize profit and to make more money year after year after year after year. And what that means, if their profits are not bigger than they were last year, then there's something wrong and they have to do something about it. Layoffs are a part of that, cost-cutting measures, like whatever they can possibly do to make sure that they're making as much profit as they possibly can, they're going to do it. Because otherwise, if their profits are smaller than they were, they don't have to be losing money. It's just if they made $10 billion in profit in 2022, but in 2023 they made 9.99999 billion, then it's like, sound the fucking alarm. We got to do something about that because the shareholders aren't going to be happy. The stock price is going to go down, and it's just like fucking Armageddon, right? They can't have that. It needs to be a perpetual growth, which is not sustainable if you actually think about it. Every industry is going to have some type of downturn in it, and it's not going to just go up every single year all the fucking time. So, because all these companies are responding to that with layoffs, in Microsoft's case, it was just because of the acquisition of Activision, so anytime that there's a merger or acquisition, there's always going to be layoffs, no matter what. That's called consolidation. You don't need two people for the same role that both companies have, if it's one company now. But this isn't some brand new phenomena that just started now. Oh my god, 2023 had so many layoffs, and now 2024, we're only 2 months in. It seems like there's so many layoffs, but if you look at it just analytically, it's something that's happened all the time. It's not really something that's happening so much more than it did before. So, yeah, no, it's a narrative that people like to push. There's a lot of fear-mongering and a lot of people who, you know, it's good for clicks, too. Like, oh my god, all these layoffs, the video game industry is in trouble. I've seen so many videos like that pop up in my recommended, and it's just like such a fundamental misunderstanding of how capitalism works, pretty much. And that's not me saying, oh, because capitalism has flaws, I believe in socialism. You're a clown if you're a socialist and you play these big AAA video games that cost hundreds of $1,000,000 to make. Like, you realize in a socialist world, stuff like that simply could not exist. If you're an indie gamer and you play like $10 things that two people made in their garage, then fine. But if you're actually like actively engaging in the so-called capitalist, greedy society, well, you're part of it if you have a $1,000 iPhone and you spend $70 on however many video games a year. Like, yeah, no. Can't have your cake and eat it too. Or at least I can't take you seriously if you do. As far as Sony's layoffs are concerned, its main thing was its VR studio in London, which I think says more about the state of VR than it does about Sony and PlayStation as a whole. I mean, yeah, they invested a lot in VR and it hasn't really paid off, but I think VR has been this failing thing that people have been trying so hard to prop up for years, and it just never materialized, and it's time that people finally give up on that shit, because it's going nowhere. But really think about that. 41 years since the last crash. Well, it technically ended in 85, so 39 years. Still, that is more than most people's lifetime, people who are watching this video. I don't have too many 39-year-olds that watch my channel, so that is most people who weren't even born yet the last time the industry had a crash. And a lot of shit has happened over the past 40 years where you think that all the pieces would be in the right place for an industry like the video game industry to crash, but it never has. The only two times where it did, it was because the industry was at its infancy and it was still trying to figure out all the kinks. In the case of the first crash in 77, it was literally just Pong consoles. That was the entire console gaming industry, and almost the entire video game industry was Pong and Pong-like games. They all played the same and were just boring after a while, so you can't prop up an entire industry on what was essentially a passing fad, right? So when people lost interest in Pong, so did they lose interest in the entire video game industry, which led to the 77 crash. Then in 1983, it was a multitude of different factors kind of culminating together, but it had nothing to do with E.T., it had nothing to do with Pac-Man, on the Atari 2600. Those are myths that have no basis in reality, that those two games single-handedly caused the entire collapse of an industry. No. The reason why Pong did in 77 is because it was the only game that was available to play. But at that point, 83, there were so many different games that you could play that 2 bad games was not enough to crash a multi-billion-dollar industry. It just wasn't. So what it was a number of things, mainly a thing called retail glut, which essentially was the game manufacturers printing way too many cartridges than there were actually people that wanted to buy those cartridges. So the supply was much, much higher than demand, because they assumed that demand was going to keep going up and up and up and up and up over the years, but they overestimated significantly. The cost of those unsold cartridges was not passed on to the retailer like it typically is, because video games were an unproven concept. So in order to get into a store like Sears or Montgomery Ward, they had to have a special deal in place where the brick and mortar stores wouldn't have any financial risk in selling these games, because all the unsold cartridges had to be paid for and returned by the game manufacturer. So let's say Atari publishes a game for their 2600 console. They anticipate 10 million copies sold, but there's only 8 million. The extra 2 million copies that were not sold, Atari has to eat the cost for all of that. So they're ended up taking a loss for all these game sales. And it's not necessarily that the game itself was bad, or that the game itself was so bad that it made people not buy it. Pac-Man was the best-selling Atari 2600 game of all time. So it had nothing to do with demand and people not wanting the game because it was bad. No, it was because they printed way too many copies, and it ended up biting them in the ass. And also, third-party publishers were completely unregulated. So anytime that a third-party publisher sold a game for the 2600, Atari didn't see a dime of the profit for those games. So, like, imagine the PlayStation 5 and how little money it would make if they didn't take any money from any third-party sales. They'd make no money. They'd go bankrupt. And that's exactly what happened with Atari, which triggered the 1983 crash. So there really isn't, I can't envision anything like that ever happening again, because you see a thing like a Pow World that is made by a small indie studio no one's ever heard of before Pow World was released, and they make billions of dollars within a couple of weeks. Like, it's crazy. And there's so many other games from these smaller studios. EA, Sony, and Microsoft are not the entire industry. Even if all those companies were losing money and were in financial trouble, it wouldn't cause the entire industry to implode. It would cause it to adapt and change in a lot of ways, but never completely collapse. I think of the biggest games that we've had over the past decade. I think of games like Rocket League. I think of No Man's Sky. I think of Fall Guys, Among Us, Minecraft, and even the recently released Helldivers 2 is a game that wasn't really made by a large company. It was published by Sony, but let's not pretend like Arrowhead Studios is anything like Naughty Dog or Insomniac as far as the resources and money that comes into that. Like, no. They're a pretty small studio themselves, and Helldivers 2 has taken the world by storm. So, my point is, there is so many different options that the consumer has that if they don't like certain things that are going on with companies like EA, then they can say, okay, we're just going to play something else, you know? So I don't really necessarily think that, I mean, unless people just decide suddenly they don't want to play video games anymore, but I feel like it's become such a huge thing that's ingrained in our culture. It's like movies and TV isn't going to go away. It's going to change in a lot of ways for sure. Like, the movie and TV industries are completely unrecognizable from the way they were just, never mind 10 years ago, but 5 years ago, right? With streaming and everything taking off the way it has. And the video game industry as well has changed a lot for the better and a lot for the worse, but it's always changing. It's never dying. So I think people need to calm down a little bit with the rhetoric. Even someone like me who is pretty cynical when it comes to video games and a lot of stuff that's been happening with modern gaming, I myself have to admit that there's no way, like, just because I have become a little bit disenfranchised with video games and don't really feel the same connection to them as I did when I was younger, doesn't mean that it's not relevant for like pretty much everybody else. There is a perceived notion in the community that there is like this decline in video games, this decline, but the money says something. It tells a completely different story. Record high revenue for pretty much every video game company, well, you know, all the major ones at least, and you have all these new indie studios like every year that keep popping up and making billions of dollars off of their games. So really, in reality, there's no decline happening at all. We're not witnessing it, and we probably never will.